Thank you for coming to the honors section of the program. This afternoon we have 5 students who will be presenting the culminating work of their honors project, to which they've devoted a tremendous amount of time. And I do want to let everyone know that the 6th student listed on the program, Samantha Flynn, has already graduated. She was not able to be in attendance today, so we'll just be having the first 5. These students, again, have spent a tremendous amount of time. They have gone into great detail to research and present their work in a most impressive fashion. I think I'll leave it to you to see that what I'm telling you is quite accurate in that regard. And so what we're going to do is each of them will present. We'll try to have each of them leave at least 3 or 4 minutes for questions in between each of these. And so we'll begin with Mr. Charles Boyd. Charles?
Good afternoon. My name is Charles Boyd, and I'm going to talk to you today about my honors thesis project entitled Justice Not Long Delayed: Historical Perspective and the 21st Century Fight for Gay Rights. Why is the issue of formulating a strategy for achieving equal rights for gays and lesbians so important? I'm reminded of 2 quotes. The first quote is by the abolitionist Wendell Phillips, and the quote is, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty." The second quote that I'm reminded of is the quote by President William McKinley: "Nothing can be permanently settled until the right of every citizen to participate equally in our state and national affairs is unalterably fixed." Now, as a historian, I believe that one of the most important tactics of formulating a successful strategy to achieve equal rights for gays and lesbians is to look at how previous movements for equal rights succeeded. And that was what I've spent a lot of my paper doing. In order to be looked at, for comparison and for influence, a movement had to meet 2 qualities, qualifications. The first qualification is that the movement had to have been an attempt by a group of people to achieve equal rights under the law when they had previously been denied equal rights based on an immutable trait such as race or sex. The second qualification that I felt was very important is that the movement had to have been successful, at least from a legal standpoint. The movement that I devoted the most attention to was the abolitionist movement, because I believe that the abolitionists were really the first faction in the United States to actually push for equal rights for everyone. They were the first group to really argue that Americans shouldn't be denied equal rights based on immutable traits like race. Now, unfortunately, there aren't any veterans of the abolitionist movement alive today. However, I was able to consult with prominent historians James McPherson and Eric Foner regarding abolitionist tactics that could be useful if the gay rights movement were to use them. I also consulted a number of historical texts, both written by the abolitionists themselves and written by other historians. The civil rights movement, which is another movement that I looked at, had the added advantage of having a number of veterans still alive today. So I was lucky enough to speak with Congressman John Lewis, Julian Bond, and Tom Houck. I was also able to speak with Walter Nagel, the partner of the late civil rights leader Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin, it's worth noting, because Bayard Rustin is not particularly well known today. He's becoming a bit more well known, but he still isn't usually one of the first few names that people mention when they talk about the civil rights leaders. But Bayard Rustin was born a gay black man in an era when racism was the norm in America and homosexuality was almost universally stigmatized. because of Bayard Rustin's sexual orientation, a large portion of the work that he did in the civil rights movement was done behind the scenes. Some of it was in public, but it was largely behind closed doors. But Bayard Rustin was undeniably one of the most significant leaders of the civil rights movement. In my discussion with Congressman John Lewis, he described how John Lewis and the other 5 members of the Big Six, which was the term for the 6 civil rights leaders, John Lewis, Whitney Young, Martin Luther King Jr., James Farmer, A. Philip Randolph, and Roy Wilkins, who were most involved in the March on Washington. And Congressman Lewis describes how he, Martin Luther King Jr., and James Farmer caucused in order to have A. Philip Randolph put in charge of the March on Washington. And the reason why they did this is because they knew that A. Philip Randolph would make Bayard Rustin his deputy and allow Bayard Rustin to be involved in planning the March on Washington, despite the fact that other civil rights leaders like Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young were concerned that Bayard Rustin's sexual orientation would draw more controversy to the movement. So, as Congressman Lewis points out, it was really Bayard Rustin who did, quote, all the work. Congressman Lewis also says that the March on Washington would have been like, quote, a bird without wings, end quote, had it not been for Bayard Rustin's help. So because Bayard Rustin is unfortunately deceased, and because Walter Nagel probably knew him better than anyone else, I felt that he would be an invaluable resource for this paper, so I was very pleased to get to interview him. One of the tactics that the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, the American Indian movement, the anti-apartheid movement have all used is civil disobedience. And I believe that it would be very surprising if the gay rights movement was successful without some amount of civil disobedience, because civil disobedience is one of the most common, longest-running traditions of equal rights movements. I also believe that based on both my personal experience as a gay rights activist and my readings of history, and I might add my conversations with Congressman Lewis and Tom Houck, that a successful gay rights movement must be integrated. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that heterosexual gay rights activists must be allowed to work alongside LGBT activists in the same organizations at the same events. The abolitionist movement and the civil rights movement were both integrated. That was a major reason for their success, because activists were able to work cohesively in biracial organizations. And if you look at the history of Congressman Lewis when he was in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he worked very hard, albeit unsuccessfully, to keep the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee integrated, because he realized that it was absolutely vital for people of different races to be able to work together for equal rights. Now, one issue that has been discussed a lot among gay rights activists that I felt had to be addressed in my paper is what branch or level of government should gay rights activists focus energy on? The legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch, the federal level, the state level, and what I concluded is that the answer is all of them. On the one hand, it's very clear that a long-term goal of the gay rights movement needs to be federal action to grant equal rights to gays and lesbians in all 50 states. Because make no mistake about it, we have had an incredible degree of momentum in the last couple of years. I have had to repeatedly update my paper to keep pace with the changes that have been made on gay rights. But the fact remains that in most of the country, gays and lesbians are not allowed to legally get married. In many states, they are legally discriminated against in adoption. And there is no federal legislation that protects them from workplace or housing discrimination. So the issue of gay rights is not only a pressing issue, but it is something that federal action needs to be taken on, because a person's civil rights should not be contingent on whether they live in Massachusetts or Mississippi. That was true in the days of the abolitionist movement. That was true in the days of the civil rights movement. It's true now. And it's also worth noting that 5 years ago, when I would suggest that there should be a constitutional amendment for equal rights for all Americans regardless of sexual orientation, this amendment was considered impossible by all but the most optimistic gay rights supporters and the most paranoid gay rights opponents. Now, however, there is a distinct possibility that such a law could be passed in the foreseeable future. According to a 2013 Gallup poll, 52% of Americans would favor a federal law legalizing gay marriage in all 50 states. Perhaps more surprisingly, roughly a third of Republicans favor such a law. And in one of the most strong displays of support for such a proposed law, 60% of American Catholics would favor legislation legalizing gay marriage in all 50 states. So the momentum is such that that is a distinct possibility. However, I would caution strongly against gay rights activists relying only on the federal level, because oftentimes individual states move faster than the federal government on civil rights. Again, that was true in the days of slavery and segregation. It's true now. That's why we have gay marriage in 17 states. So I think that it would be counterproductive for the gay rights movement to focus only on getting the federal government to act. I also believe that the judicial branch should be relied on some, but not exclusively, because one of the best-kept secrets of American politics is that a court has a very limited ability to enforce its decisions if both the president and Congress are hostile to them. The Native American tribes of Georgia and the rest of the Southeast unfortunately found this out the hard way in the 1800s when the Supreme Court ruled that the state of Georgia could not deprive them of their land. And then Andrew Jackson, who was president at the time, basically declared that the Supreme Court could not enforce its edict and proceeded to move the tribes west against their will. So in conclusion, probably the most important take-home messages from this are, number one, that gay rights activists must insist on immediate change. Change, indeed, certainly equal rights, will not come immediately, but it won't even come in the foreseeable future if gay rights activists do not continue to demand equal rights now. And to quote Martin Luther King, as I referenced in my title, justice too long delayed is justice denied. I would also urge everyone to remember that complacency is the enemy of progress. The successes that we have seen on the part of the gay rights movement in recent years did not come about because gay rights activists were willing to push gently and be satisfied with small, incremental, symbolic changes. Rather, the reforms that we have seen have happened because gay rights activists have continued to fight hard. The day will come when gays and lesbians have equal rights. There's really no doubt about that anymore. The question is, will it happen sooner or will it happen later? And as a historian and as an activist and as an American, I want that change to come sooner. And that's really what my paper is about, is how can we make this happen as soon as possible? Thank you. That's a very good question, and I think that we can see watershed moments. I mean, usually there's more than one watershed moment, but if I had to look at the biggest watershed moment with the abolitionist movement that really set them on the path to victory, because I think in this case we're talking about watershed moments that didn't achieve victory immediately, but set the movement on the path to victory. With the abolitionist movement, I would say that would have had to have been the Emancipation Proclamation, because it really put the momentum solidly in the abolitionist camp and eventually did lead to the abolition of slavery shortly thereafter. I would say with the Civil Rights Movement, it would have to be Brown versus Board of Education. I would say with the Gay Rights Movement, it would be November of 2012, because there was one night in November of 2012 when a bunch of different things happened that really sped up the process for gay rights. Number one, the first pro-gay marriage presidential candidate nominated by a major party and serving as president at the time won re-election. It wasn't even all that close. The second thing was that the first openly lesbian senator was elected. And the third thing was that for the first time ever, voters in 3 states voted to legalize same-sex marriage, and voters in another state voted down a constitutional amendment against same-sex marriage. So that was really the moment when I woke up the next morning and I'm like, okay, this is going to happen, and it's going to happen in my lifetime. That's a good question. I think that that's going to be very tough to predict, because I think on the one hand, it seems like with gay rights that there's a difference with abolitionism where there's not a massive system of profit that's connected with denying gays equal rights like there was with slavery. It's hard for me to imagine the Christian right, for instance, launching a civil war to keep denying gays and lesbians equal rights. I also think that there's more momentum in the so-called red states for gay rights than there was in the South for civil rights in the 50s and early 60s. That said, I definitely think there's going to be some backlash, and we probably will see a period of time when anti-gay violence does spike before eventually going back down again. I mean, I think that there's always these kind of convulsions when this country moves in the directions of equal rights. It's kind of like when you have to remove a boil. You know, it's definitely very, very necessary, but it's also painful.
The recent removal of, I believe it was Mozilla CEO, who's donated $1,000 to do you think that those kind of tactics are appropriate ways to approach equal rights? Or do you think that alienated a lot of people who maybe would have supported equal rights, but now they see it in a tolerant atmosphere? So what do you think? How does that play into the tactics and strategies?
Well, I'll tell you, I can understand both sides of the debate over the Mozilla CEO or Mozilla CEO in the sense that I can, I believe he was a CEO, in the sense that I can understand the argument that he should not have been fired, and I can understand the argument that he should have been fired. My personal stance on this is that it was a necessary step, you know, on the path to gay and lesbian equality for him to no longer be running that company, because there's the old expression, he who respects my dollar must respect my person. And if the government had intervened and said, okay, he's got to step down or he's going to jail or whatever, I would be strongly against that. But because it was a private corporation, you know, I mean, I think it really was the appropriate course of action for him to no longer be working there. As far as whether or not it's going to alienate people, I think it's probably not going to alienate a ton of people who are on the fence about it. It's certainly not going to alienate gay rights supporters because, there have definitely been cases where people have lost their job over racism, and it doesn't make people who support civil rights go back and think, oh, gee, I wish we could bring back segregation. The most that could happen is it's going to make some people think, okay, I support gay rights and I'm going to continue to support gay rights, but I think that was a little bit excessive. So basically, to answer your question, I don't think it's going to have a negative impact on the gay rights movement, and I think it was a necessary step in the right direction.
Thank you, John.
Next up is Kirsten Glazer, and she will be telling us about Till Death Do Us Part, the evolution of monogamy. Could I ask also that for the questions for the remaining speakers, if the questioner would come to the microphone, because otherwise it's not being picked up by the recording. Thank you.
I guess Dr. Rulison kind of stole my thunder by already announcing my title, but I will be discussing the evolution of monogamy in human beings. And just as a disclaimer, I will be talking about sexual topics and evolution, so if any of you feel uncomfortable, I would strongly suggest you to leave the room now. I am also... As another disclaimer, I would like to say that in my presentation today, I'm not going to say that, monogamy is the one true marriage pattern that all societies should have. I'm not going to be poo-pooing, so to speak, on other marriage patterns that other cultures might have. So I just want to throw that out there before I begin. And so to start off, I just want to go over some basic terms. They're pretty, good terms that almost everyone essentially knows of, but just to go over, because there are several versions of what monogamy might be. And in the animal kingdom, monogamy is mostly referred to as, when two of the opposite sexes come together for reproduction, but it only lasts throughout a mating season, whereas when I'm discussing monogamy, I'm talking about like the lifetime monogamy that most of us associate with it. And then going into the term polygamy, a lot of us know of polygamy because of Mormons, and we automatically think, oh, here we are in the United States, polygamy is Mormons, one husband with multiple wives, when in reality polygamy is, as I say here, it's a marriage that includes more than two partners regardless of sex. And with polygamy, there's two branches where there's polygyny and polyandry. Polygyny is the one that we associate Mormons with, which there is one husband, multiple wives, whereas polyandry is one woman, multiple husbands. And so, with that being said, okay, so I kind of want to interact it so I'm not talking to you guys constantly throughout my 15 minutes. So just throwing this out there, by a show of hands, how many of us have divorced parents? That's actually not that many. I was expecting a lot more. Well, as a sociologist, we're constantly thrown and hearing these statistics where, as I have up here, 60% of marriages for couples between the ages of 20 and 25 are going to end in a divorce. And, there's a 50% chance that a marriage ends in a divorce and things like that we constantly as sociologists hear. And then, couples that are more likely to cohabitate with one another, which is where they live with one another, are more likely to end up in a divorce. And, we constantly hear these terrible statistics. Unfortunately for you with divorced parents, there's more likelihood of you guys your marriage ending up in a divorce more so than me. And that percentage increases when your significant other also comes from a household with parents that have, divorced marriage. So we're constantly bombarded with these questions of like, well, damn, why do we get married then? If we're constantly hearing these statistics like marriage is this terrible thing, why are we restricting ourselves to monogamy? Are we even monogamous? And so I especially think monogamy isn't natural. Get over it, ladies, is my favorite, because we constantly associate females might be monogamous, or at least you hear that in research, but men definitely aren't. We're restricting men. They're these sexual wild creatures. They need to go out and, get busy with it and have fun. And so it makes us sit down and think, why are we getting married? Why are we forcing ourselves into these social norms that we shouldn't be putting ourselves into? And so that's where the basic of my presentation comes from, is are humans truly monogamous? Are we allowed to be monogamous? Why do we force ourselves into marriage? Is it something that we should do? And so in studying this, we have two different ways to look at monogamy. Monogamy as a mating pattern and monogamy as a marriage pattern, which, despite the fact that they seem kind of identical to one another, in reality, they're necessarily not. And so in studying this, you have the mating pattern, which is, opposite sex come together for procreation, where marriage is, there's a union between two individuals and what type of union that entails. And so first I'll be going over the mating pattern. And in the mating pattern, we have evolution. And this is where the evolution aspect comes into it. And so with evolution, there are three phenomena that occurred through our timeline that allowed humans, or at least, it seems to be that it allowed humans to become monogamous creatures. And those three things are mutated traits, bipedalism, which is the ability to stand upright, and then male parental involvement. And with mutated traits, okay, so this is for the females in the room, and please don't feel uncomfortable. I really want you to participate. But by a show of hands, how many of us know exactly to the moment, right, on this day at this hour, I'm ovulating? I'm actually surprised. Okay, so not many of us raised our hands, and that's normal because we don't know. It is nearly impossible or extremely difficult for us to know about that, and that is thanks to mutated traits. And if any of us have dogs or cats, or, you just are familiar with the term in heat, animals, and this occurred, at the beginning of our evolution, animals have something called the estrus cycle, which I don't want to throw this term out there because I don't want you to compare it to a menstrual cycle, because it's nothing like a menstrual cycle, but it's the easiest way to put it in your mind. And during this estrus cycle, it is when a female's genitalia enlarges and swells up and gets red, much like the butt of the primate to the far left. It swells up and it indicates to males that I am in heat. I can conceive right now. And so occasionally there's odor produced that allows that to happen. But with humans, we don't have any of that at all. I don't know about you females in the room, but that doesn't happen to me. And so this occurred because of our mutated traits. There were these few selective females that had the ability, and it's called hidden ovulation. I'm sorry about my throat. I just happened to get sick at the wrong time. But we had this ability for hidden ovulation, and that's where they don't know. Males in the room don't know when we're ovulating, and for the most part, we don't know when we're ovulating. And what's interesting about the estrus cycle is that is the only time period in which animals procreate with one another. They do not copulate at any other time other than during the estrus cycle. And that's the only time a female can conceive. Humans don't have that. We could copulate at any time, any place, during our pregnancy, immediately after we give birth. And so that happened because of these mutated traits, and females had this mutated trait that allowed them to, males don't know when I'm ovulating, and because of that, I had the ability to select who I wanted to mate with. And I will get into why that was an advantage later on. And so the next thing that occurred, which it's not necessarily a timeline, but for the purpose of my essay that I put it in, is bipedalism, which is the ability to stand upright. And with that, it completely changed our entire structure of our body. And the most important thing that it changed, especially for females, is our pelvis bone. And if you could see at the chimpanzee, I don't know what button to press, so I don't want to turn it off. But if you look at the chimpanzee, you see all the spotted dots around. Do you guys see that? Okay, so when a chimpanzee, okay, thank you. Okay, all of that right there. That is when a female chimpanzee gives birth, that is essentially the wiggle room for the infant. He can move, it has a lot of space. Unfortunately, I don't know if I could, there you go. Unfortunately, that's all we have as females. That's all our wiggle room. And that's attributed to bipedalism, because when we stood up, it completely changed the shape of our pelvis bone, which made giving birth extremely difficult, as you can obviously tell. And so what that did was females who gave birth to, naturally large brain infants died in the middle of labor because they couldn't push the infant out. Whereas, females or in our ancestry line who gave birth to infants that were premature and had a softer skull survived, carrying on the trait of giving birth to smaller infants. And what that did was it gave humans or females, they completely lost their independence. Now I have the ability to use my arms, but I have to carry an infant at the same time. So I can't ward off a predator and find food while carrying an infant. And so what that did was it led to male parental involvement, which I don't have a slide for. But it is male parental involvement, came around this sex contract where I had a male and there was me. And so we kind of made this contract between one another where you provide food and protection, I'll give you sex. And so with that trading, it was kind of like, I'm assuring you that I'm not sleeping around with any other males, and that this child that you are protecting and offering food is your own. But, that's still seen in the animal kingdom today with pair bondings, but those pair bondings end up breaking up after that child has fully matured. And that kind of occurred with our ancestors until recently. Dr. Kip Opie at University College of London discovered that infanticide, which is the intentional killing of infants, brought upon monogamy in human beings, where males noticed that, you procreate with me and 2 other females and then turn around and act like nothing's done. But then behind your back, another male comes around, kills those infants, and immediately after, I start ovulating again, and so they procreate with me, I give birth to their infant, carrying on their genes. And so because of that whole incident, males decided, if I stick by this female side until the infant has fully matured, then we won't have to worry about infanticide. And during that time period, this one infant's maturing, we might have 2 or 3 other children during the process, leading to the evolution of monogamy in human beings. So despite the fact that humans are not naturally monogamous in the sense that we weren't put on this planet, having one-on-one relationships with one another, we have evolved the traits to be monogamous if we want to. But that's not all that is to the story, because we also have things such as culture. And culture completely directly influences it. So despite the fact that we might be able to be monogamous and have monogamous relationships, our marriage patterns dictate whether or not we carry out those monogamous traits. And so I just wanted to zoom in on that, but I forgot about that. Okay, so with marriage pattern, it kind of evolved during the agricultural revolution. Damn it. Okay, so I'll try to go as fast as I can. With the agricultural revolution came about farming, and we had the hunters and the gatherers. The females were the gatherers, the males were the hunters. The females noticed something, that when you dropped a seed, a plant grew. Therefore, farming came about, and females were the original farmers. Then came along man, and man invented the plow. And with the plow, females stopped being able to be farmers because they didn't have the upper body strength to use the plow and things like that. So with the invention of the plow, females kind of became lower, male became, yes, male, I am warrior, hear me roar. And what I find interesting is in this picture, the males are cultivating, climbing up trees, using the plow. Females are pregnant with children. And so that essentially became the role of the female. We were no longer equal. And with this whole land, and we had a surplus of food because of farming, and with the surplus of food came, an increase in population. With an increase of population came the need for property. And for the first time ever, because of the agricultural revolution, we had the need of ownership and property. And with that, this is my piece of land. I don't want you to have it. I don't want you to have it. I want my future generations to have this piece of land. So there came the concept of ownership. And with that came monogamous marriages. In that, I don't want to pass on my piece of land to someone that isn't related to me. I want to pass it on to someone that's directly related to me. So that's how monogamy came about, and this was mostly seen in Eurasia. But we also have other cultures that don't have it, such as polyandry and polygyny. And those cultures choose other marriage patterns for different reasons. Like in Africa, as I show here, this is the rate of where, the highest population of polygyny is seen, and it's mostly in Africa. These African societies tend to choose these because they have high infant mortality rates, as we could see here. So if you just compare, this is the red and the orange and the yellow is where there's high infant mortality rates. This is where there's polygyny. High infant mortality rates, polygyny. Just so you can see the comparison that these cultures choose to do that because it's more efficient for them. It's more efficient for a man to have 3 wives and 3 children with each of them than just to have 1 wife and 2 children because they need the workers on their farm. And with polyandry, that is the least I don't want to say used, but the least common marriage type, in that there's less than 1% of cultures that have polyandry, but they do have them, and in the societies that have them, it is more of a choice than it is something enforced. So at the end of the day with this presentation, I want you, I threw all these statistics at you saying that you're going to get married, but you're also going to get a divorce at the same time, and I don't want you to walk away from here saying, damn, I shouldn't get married. Because what the purpose of this presentation was to show you that, despite the fact that people are constantly thinking, we shouldn't get married because we're going to end a divorce, at the end of the day, that's not necessarily true. And what's happening is that marriage doesn't have a definition because it's extremely difficult to define it without excluding other cultures. And with that, it is constantly adapting. So divorce is not threatening marriage. Marriage as a definition, as defined in our culture, is adapting. And despite the fact that it might not seem that we're meant to be monogamous, despite the fact that we've, evolved the traits to be able to be monogamous, we've gone away from the marriage of our parents. The professors in here define marriage completely different than how we define it, completely different from how our grandparents define it. And monogamy today, as we define it in society, is more of serial monogamy, where it's a continuation of these small monogamous relationships. I get married, but I get married for 10 years, get a divorce, and then go into another monogamous relationship. So at the end of the day, it's not necessarily that divorce is a threat to marriage. Marriage, as we know it, is coming to an end. It's the slippery slope. That's not necessarily true. Marriage is just this extremely fluid term that's constantly adapting to today's society. And with that, I would like to have a special thanks to Dr. Stone, Dr. Collins, and Dr. Wise, and Dr. Rolson for putting up with me for the past 2 years. Please don't make it a difficult one.
Yeah. So one of the things you said was that one of the benefits of polygyny, the man with multiple wives, was, I'm going to produce as many children as I can. What are some of the benefits of polyandry on the reverse? Because it doesn't seem like there would be many sexual benefits to the woman who can only produce one child.
There isn't, and in the cultures that do allow polyandry, they don't necessarily do it because, this is beneficial. One of the cultures that does allow polyandry is Tibet. And they allow it in the sense of fraternal polyandry, which is multiple brothers marry one wife. And the reason why they do that is to keep property in the family instead of dividing it up. And so it's not necessarily, like you said, there is no sexual benefits, so to speak, but there are other cultural benefits that come with polyandry. Does that kind of answer your question, Antonio? Kind of, yeah, okay. Any other questions?
Kirsten? You can't cover the topic in 15 minutes.
Yeah, I know.
But a couple items on your deck. Number one, polygamy developed long before there was anything like good infant patterns of survival. The human race has existed against very serious death rates, mortality rates in infancy, and the data you have on today is really irrelevant to the question of the development of marriage patterns worldwide, because that happened long before the present pattern held. There are several items also about the nature of humans that you didn't have time for, I think, but are relevant to your evolution discussions. The size of the head of human infants is every bit as important as the size of the female pelvis. And we don't know exactly how they developed in parallel. The human lack of hair is an enormous factor in the fact that a woman has to carry a child around. Other primates, they hold on to the hair of the mother, and the mother's hands, if you will, are free. There are a number of other things that tie in there that make the whole thing the argument harder to make. It's very complex.
No, it completely is. And one topic that I didn't discuss is sexual selection, which are there these, and that goes along with Helen Fisher, which is the anthropologist I've used for most of my research, discusses sexual selection, and that kind of attributes to the hairlessness of us, that, for something we don't know what. That's the thing with evolution, it's extremely difficult to pinpoint anything. It's all speculation because we have no evidence to assist us. So, yeah.
None of these students can do justice to their work in the 15 minutes that they have available, and it's but we do have to get through this. So next up is Chris Yalen. He'll be talking about video games. I think.
Yes. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So like Dr. Wilson said, I'm Chris, and today I'll be talking about what we call the immersive medium. And it's a bit of an interdisciplinary paper. It's not just about video games. It's about three big things. It's about art, and it's about a concept from positive psychology that we call flow. And then it also, of course, is about video games. So I'm just going to go ahead and get right into it. One of the sort of ideas or general concept that's interested me in my recent research on video games is, wrong button. Oh, sorry. Technical difficulties. Recent question is, what do people seek from video games? Is it fun? Is it escape? Or is it a different experience altogether? So if we think of two popular video games, within the same genre, say like Call of Duty and Battlefield. These games are actually, if you strip away everything that makes one Call of Duty and one Battlefield, the actual game mechanics that lie underneath are actually remarkably similar, almost completely identical if you really think about it. There's lots of pointing, lots of shooting, and lots of rewards, essentially. And it's these base mechanics are so similar. Why do we keep buying new games every year? I mean, in theory, you should be able just to keep that same game and keep playing it because at the end of the day, it's the same thing. And so this doesn't explain why people go out and buy multiple entries of the same genre. And so my sort of thing I'm proposing is that gamers are in there for an experience. And that experience might be, and hopefully over the course of this presentation I'll be able to convince you, that it's actually an artistic experience that gamers are looking for when they're playing these games. Now, that's not necessarily true for every single game, but I feel like that there is a new evolving strata of artistic video games that offers this experience for their gamers. Now, granted, some have disagreed with this, and actually one of those is the late Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times. Ebert wrote a blog article in 2010 called Why Video Games Can Never Be Art. And it was actually, I'm not trying to use Ebert as a straw man here. He actually did a really great job at bringing up some critiques of treating video games as art. And I actually would like to try to discuss some of those as a jumping off point before we get into it. So here are some of Ebert's critiques. The first is that, we really can't define art, and that will be a problem. I've tried to make a working definition as best as I can, but obviously, there will be many who might disagree, and that will be something that is, I guess, part of the inherently subjective nature of art. But another thing is that, art, as Ebert puts it, is supposed to lead you to an inevitable conclusion, not a smorgasbord of choices. And I have a bit of a contention with this one because, obviously art is a subjective thing, as I just mentioned, and we think about artistic interpretation a lot. Everyone has a different idea of what art is, so how could you say that art is always supposed to lead you to an inevitable conclusion when you just said that, art is something that we all can't agree on? So, with that being said, I'm just going to jump down to number 4. Kind of thinking about all of this, if there are artistic games, which ones are artistic, and what criteria does a game have to sort of meet in order to be one of these artistic games? And so here is my thesis sort of in a nutshell, that these artistic games, in fact, do exist, and by employing an interdisciplinary approach, we can define a criteria for them, find games that meet this criteria, and then see if there's a measurable difference between these games. And so the approach I'll be using is first I'm going to start off, and I've read some different philosophers during my thesis research. I read Aristotle, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, David Hume, and then I also read a little bit of Edmund Burke, but although I read him specifically for one particular game. So I've employed some of the approaches that these philosophers use, and I've sort of taken ideas from them, and I'm using them to help develop my criteria for these games. Then I'm evaluating my games using these criteria, and then finally, I'm going to be talking about how, if we can see if there's a measurable difference between artistic games and non-artistic games. And I'll be using this by using the concept of flow. For those of you who are not familiar with flow, I will touch on that a little bit more in depth later, but just sort of kind of put a pin in it for right now. So these are the criteria that I have developed, and I'm just going to touch on just a few of these really quick. Numbers 1 through 3 are mainly sort of general given circumstances or guidelines that we can think about when considering games. So these are sort of things that I just wanted to sort of, give the idea that, these are sort of the basic ideas we're sort of operating under. But where the rubber meets the road is really numbers 4 through 7. And so just really quick to touch on number 5, that the characters of artistic games are developed in order to inspire empathy. This is not necessarily true for every single artistic video game out there, although I feel like that it is a general criteria that many art games that are artistic actually do happen to meet, which is why I included it on this list. So given this criteria, I then applied this criteria to some specific games. And so these are those. So Bioshock Infinite, I'm just going to touch on just one quality of each of these games, and hopefully if we have some questions, I can maybe delve in a little bit deeper later. But so one of the great things about Bioshock Infinite is that it had very dynamic characters that sort of evolved over the course of the game. One of the characters that you meet is Elizabeth, who is right here in this middle panel, as you can see. She starts off as a very Disney princess-like figure when you very first start playing Bioshock Infinite. But by the time you finish, she actually has evolved into this sort of omniscient, all-powerful being, and something one to be feared over the course of the game. And so lots of very strong visual and literary storylines in here, and lots of themes embedded with both the visual and the story itself. So we have lots of themes about Bioshock takes place in the early 1900s, and we have lots of themes about Reconstruction, things about advancements in science, like people like Max Planck and Einstein being referenced quite often, and then also the idea of American exceptionalism, that idea that America is great because we are inherently American, plays a lot into the thematic ideas behind Bioshock. So with that, I feel like that it made a very strong candidate because it meets a lot of these criteria, like the strong storyline and these empathetic characters that you get to know over the course of the game. The same thing with Mass Effect 2. Mass Effect 2 is a sort of a space opera. It's set within that sort of space opera science fiction genre. But one of the cool things about Mass Effect is that it actually allows you to make dynamic choices with the storyline itself. So you actually get to kind of choose how your story plays out. Now, this offers the player a lot of agency. And that will come important when we talk about flow later, because one of the components of flow is to have agency over your actions. So Mass Effect really gave that to its players in the sense of the storyline. And it also had a really good storyline to boot. So I felt like this sort of met very well in that sense. Finally, we have Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. So Skyrim, this is where Edmund Burke sort of comes to play. So Skyrim's a really scary place to walk around if anyone's ever had the chance to play it. You've got dragons flying around, trying to eat you, essentially. You have many mountains you can crawl up and fall off and die. I have done that many a time in Skyrim. But one of the things that how this relates to the Sublime is the Sublime was a concept I think put the best by a scholar named Edmund Burke, who is an 18th century Irish statesman. But he also had some ideas about the Sublime that influenced a lot of the Romantics that we see in Europe during the 19th century. And his basic idea is that, we get this aesthetic response, we feel this artistic, sort of feeling through feeling terror and feeling awe, and we could only go out and feel that by going out into nature. And Skyrim, you basically play around in nature for a lot of your time during the game, and you're basically in fear and awe of all of this nature, like these dragons, like the big mountains and cliffs you can fall off of. So I feel like that was a very, very relevant element to this particular game, and that's another reason why I think it would evoke this aesthetic response. So anyway, really quickly, so these are some of my non-artistic games. I chose these not so much for their artistic elements, or mainly for the genre, just to kind of get a feel that, there are plenty of games that are non-artistic, and there are certain genres that have more of these than others. So Angry Birds was a strategy/puzzle game, although there are puzzle games, like the Portal series that have artistic elements in them. But most of the puzzle genres, like Tetris, Bejeweled, don't really do much for us in that sense. Same thing with Plants vs. Zombies, which is a tower defense game. And then also Trials Evolution, which was a racing/exports game. So, and at the end of the day, these are all great games, wildly successful. Angry Birds, I'm sure we're all, at least familiar with it in some sense. But at the end of the day, these games don't do anything else. They don't make us rethink, humanity's place in the world. They don't make us rethink sort of preconceived notions we might have about ourselves. They're really just games. And I hate saying that, but at the same time, it is true. Or at least I consider it to be true. So anyway, to get into the, if I think work. Okay, my clicker's not working. Okay. So if we could just go ahead into the study part, and go ahead and press that again, Oliver. So the overview of the study. So I recently just finished up a 20 participant pilot study. I have a very small sample size, but I had a very large time commitment when it came to these games. So I tried to make sure that I could get as many people as I possibly could. This when I do my results later, some of my results will be affected by the sample size itself. So I have taken this into consideration. So take everything I say with a grain of salt from here on out. So anyway, I had my gamers play artistic games for 10 hours so they could work their way through the story a little bit. And then I had them play non-artistic games for about 2 hours. I figured that it was a little unfair if you only let, you play a non-artistic game for about 30 minutes, which was one of my initial idea. But I ended up bumping it up to 2 hours. That way it was going to be a little bit more even. And for the 10 hours for the artistic games, I wanted players to be able to experience the storylines of this game, since that was such an essential element to this aesthetic consideration. Also, I had a wide range of different gamers from a variety of different demographic backgrounds. I actually had a couple people actually have never even played a video game before or had professed themselves as very much non-gamers, which was great because I actually got to sort of, bring them into the fold, so to speak. But then I also had lots of very hardcore gamers as well, people who play about, 20 hours or 15 to 20 hours a week. So lots of different in that sense. Oliver? Cool. But before I go into that, I promised you guys I'd kind of explain flow a little bit. And so flow, just trying to explain it in a quick fashion, is a concept from positive psychology that is most easily expressed as a sort of a single-minded immersion. So it's basically the place where the challenge and of anything that you might do, and your skill in that challenge meet perfectly and puts you sort of in the zone or sort of on a roll, so to speak. And a hallmark of flow is a sort of a spontaneous feeling of joy or even rapture when pouring to task. Now, some of the concepts of flow are such as, the loss of the reflective self-consciousness, a loss of time or a feeling of time slipping away from you, clear objectives, an autotelic or a sort of a self-satisfying experience, clearly set goals, emerging through thought and action, concentration, good feedback, and control or a sense of agency over what you're doing. And people can be in states of high flow and medium flow as well, so you're not just, you're in or you're out. Some people experience a higher flow than others and feel like the effects are more profound. But again, so how does this all relate to art? Well, if you really think about it, when's the last time you've watched a movie or read a really, really good book, and, you're reading, and then you look at the clock a few minutes later, and you're like, oh my God, I read for 2 hours? Like, that felt like 10 minutes. That, in a sense, is flow. And we get flow from these other artistic experiences like film and like, novels. So why can't we get them from video games? So Moving on, so the measures I used for my participants, I used a standardized and validated scale for flow by Jackson and Elkund in 2002, and it was a 7-point Likert scale, and the score ranges from 0 to 6. So whenever I see my scores, 6 is basically the top range, 4 is around the middle, and then 0 is dead last. Okay. So looking at the results, as you can see already, the average and median scores sort of show that our artistic games did score higher in the flow category and then the non-artistic games. We could see that most of those scores are in the 4 range, whereas with the non-artistic games, they were in the 3 or the 4. So 4 is about medium flow, and anything from 5 and higher I would consider high flow. Anywhere from 3 to a 3.9 is a low flow experience, and anything below 3 I would categorize as a no flow experience. So they're not experiencing the flow state at all. So we just go ahead and pass that. So this was the percentage, this little pie chart really quick to show the depth of games. So about 25% of our total artistic gamers were in high flow, whereas 45% were in medium flow. And that's pretty good. About 70% of them were in sort of some medium or high flow experience, if you'll go on. And then if we look at their non-artistic, actually 35% weren't even feeling flow at all. So there was definitely a significant change between the two as far as feeling these effects. All right. Now, we did have a couple hiccups. I tried to go for a true experiment design, so my participants were randomly assigned their games. Now, because of this, that meant that some of my participants had actually played the game that they were assigned before. And so because of this, some of the game, they were playing the game twice. So they were going through the same experience. It wasn't new. It was basically like, having to reread a book for class or rewatch a movie with your friends. You're not necessarily as into that experience as you would be if you played it through the first time. So where these, the little red line, which is the non-artistic flow scores, where those go above the blue line, which is the artistic scores, those are participants who actually scored higher on the non-artistic flow survey than they did on the artistic one. So because of that, we had some sort of exceptions, but I feel like those were mitigated by the fact that all of those players who were those little peaks that I just talked about, they had all played the game I had assigned them before. So I feel like that's a mitigating factor that I'd hope to correct in future iterations of this study. And then finally, I ran some data. I did a comparisons of means t-test for any of you who don't have stat background. That's basically a very, very fancy way of saying I was trying to make sure that my differences between the averages actually meant something. And then so to look really quickly, so really what we're looking at is this SIG two-tailed test right there in the second column. What we're really looking for there is what we call a p-value that's less of 5/100ths of a point, or also known as 0.05. And as you can see, I'm at 0.003. Now, granted, this is all mitigated by the fact that I had a very low sample size, so that would be definitely something. We wouldn't be publishing these results in an academic journal of sorts yet. But it definitely, I think, shows that even despite that and the mitigating factors that we talked about with people in the artistic flow games, having played some games again, it shows that at least there's some sort of statistical leverage that we could use to at least get me into a sort of another study environment to redo this experiment again. And then one more time. So, discussion. So, again, I would love to do a larger sample size. Let people maybe play through the games in their entirety, the artistic games, so they get the full range of the experience, or maybe some deeper immersion. And then also correct that feeling of some players who might have already played it a game more than once. But then finally, as you can see, the study sort of suggests that, that my hypothesis is true, or at least sort of in the range of true. Obviously, again, would love to do the study again to maybe fix it and try to get some solid data. But it also shows some ideas, some new ways to consider flow. But then also, it helps us sort of rethink why people might play video games. And at the end of the day, to also, big question, to rethink, where we put video games in our culture, and we think about their place, which was ended up sort of being the reason why I ended up doing this study. So, the one parting words I'd like to take is to sort of, think about, what I've said. Hopefully maybe some good questions will come out of this, is that to sort of rethink, if you've ever played a video game, how did you feel and why, and sort of reevaluate, your sort of uses and gratifications from that experience. Okay. Thank you.
My question is, do you think that as video games have become more and more mainstream, do you think there's been a trend toward more intricate storylines and characterizations in the games in order to counter claims like the one made by Roger Ebert?
Okay. Charles raises a very good question, and actually, it's not so much that games are becoming more mainstream because they've become popular. It's just that games have a wider range of technology to help them being developed. So, for example, way back when in the 1980s, you'd probably have a development team of maybe 3 or 4 guys in somebody's basement out in Silicon Valley making one of these very, very early video games. Nowadays, development teams can range in the hundreds of people all working on the same video game. And because of there are more people to work on these games, there's a higher range of specialization. So there can be people who focus specifically on making these games with better story, more intricate storylines, as opposed to people of yesteryear, I think. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you all.
Next up, we have Corey Ray, who will tell us about the end of Ataturk's tutelage.
Yeah, fancy title, right? Very good. Do you have my... Hi, thank you all for staying a little bit over the time as well. I know Courtney and I will try to make sure you don't stay too long. I chose this title because Turkish politics, is a very fluid environment right now. And when I first went to Turkey in summer of 2011, I went with a Turkish organization that, painted a very rosy picture. So basically everything was expanding: profits, the economy, civil rights. I mean, it seemed like there could be no better place on earth to live than Turkey. And of course, that's how they portrayed it. And then when I studied abroad in Turkey in the previous spring, around following the Labor Day protest movement, there seemed to be a total widespread breakdown in the social order, and all of these things, the economy that was rapidly expanding began contracting, the civil rights that were expanding began to recede under a wave of repression and things like this, and this kind of really upset a lot of the models and a lot of the interpretations that political scientists had set up about Turkey and about political Islam in Turkey. So to compare the ruling party in Turkey, you see their logo here. They've been the ruling party since 2001, and while they're not strictly an Islamist party like you would interpret maybe Hamas in the Gaza Strip or the regime currently in Iran, they do draw much of their ideological foundations from their interpretation of Islam. So for this part, that's why I'm kind of lumping it together as political Islam. Yeah, you can go. So I started, given all of these breakdowns into what was happening with the models, I wanted to know, were there any lessons that could be drawn from AKP rule in Turkey in the application of Islam in a democratic political realm? Because you had, basically from 2001 when the AKP took over, you had an expansion of civil rights. You had all of these great things going on. The economy is expanding. Turkey's role in the world was increasing. And even major conflicts like the one in Cyprus, the conflict with Armenia, began to recede. So I want to know, were there any lessons that can be drawn from this, especially now, given that the more rosy, optimistic expectations for the AKP are now breaking down? Do those kind of lessons that we thought could be drawn from the first for the first 2 terms of AKP rule, can they still be applied? And then that kind of leads a little bit to the implications outside Turkey, because you have, we all know what happened with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. That didn't go so well. We all know how Hamas rule in Gaza is going right now, not so well. And then the authoritarian regime in Iran. So can we kind of get a sense of how we can apply Islam politically in a democratic realm? Just to give you a brief background, the political system in Turkey is a parliamentary democracy. There is a divided executive, and this is becoming increasingly important because you have the ceremonial role of the presidency and you have the prime minister. The current prime minister is Tayyip Erdogan, who's seen as he's the face of the party. He's a charismatic populist, but he's also increasingly becoming authoritarian, cracking down on his opponents. And actually, 2 weeks ago, he banned Twitter and YouTube, which recently became overturned by the courts. So we'll see how that goes. The president right now is Abdullah Gül, and he's known as more of the moderate, the kind of guy who seeks reconciliation. And right now, there's actually a battle within the AKP party, or within the AK party, as to what the future is going to hold. There is the Constitution, and if I had more time, I could definitely explain a little more about that. But one of the principal things is within the Constitution, secularism is enshrined. That holds a lot of importance when we're looking at the role of political Islam when secularism is like the state ideology. And I'd like to point out that secularism to the Turks is very different from what we hold more in the Anglo-Saxon realm of the separation of church and state. More secularism to the Turks, a lot like the French is, the state is over the church, or in this case the mosque. So the state is kind of suppressing religion to make sure it doesn't become authoritarian. And then you have the four major parties. And one of the main points I want to make here is that these are the four major parties. The AKP, which is a socially conservative, free market, nationalistic. I frequently kind of make the reference to they're kind of like modern Republicans, without the authoritarian sense. But they're like Republicans, socially conservative. They love the market, and they're a good bit of patriotism thrown in there to get the folks riled up. You got the second largest party is the CHP. That's a nationalistic party. So they're trying to reform themselves as social democratic in the European sense, and Kemalism, which I'll touch on a little bit later, which is the founding ideology of the state. The CHP has a lot of ties to the military, which has initiated 4 coups since the founding of the Republic of Turkey. So the CHP does have a lot of authoritarian undertones. Next is the third largest party is the MHP, which is almost fascist, I would say, in my interpretation, very nationalistic, pan-Turkic, but they are conservative in that they think Islam is good, kind of in a national, to serve the state, essentially. And then the fourth largest party is the BDP, which is the Kurdish minority, which comprises about 18 to 20% of the population. That's their ethnic party. But to point out that if we want to go back. So the AKP, is currently undergoing a little bit of an authoritarian practices right now. The CHP and MHP have large ties to the military, which they're not the most democratic folks. It's not as if you have the Islamic conservatives becoming authoritarian, and then you have all these nice liberals that are just trying to have their freedom. That's not necessarily the case. And the BDP, because they're the Kurdish party, they're also of course a lot of ties to the PKK, which is the insurgent group that until last year has been operating in southeastern Iraq, or northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey. So all four parties are kind of, it's kind of a rock and a hard place with these four. We can keep moving. So to touch on Ataturk's legacy. So Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal's actual name, Ataturk is his designated name for parliament, means father of the Turks. He's the founder of the Republic of Turkey, and his ideology, which is Kemalism, is the foundation of the state. So you have republicanism, which means, the state of Turkey shall be a republic. It shouldn't be it shouldn't be an empire. It shouldn't be a monarchy. This is reforming after the Ottoman Empire. So this is the republic. It's all about populism, which has a lot of leftist undertones in it, in that you're supposed to serve the people, social programs, things like that. Nationalism, which in this case means one unitary ethnic or one unitary state. And although he calls it the Republic of Turkey, he frequently references to Turkishness. He really, I think, intended it to mean, this is inclusive of the Kurds. Turkey is a very diverse region, so you have the Kurds there, you have the Greek Orthodox. I think he really meant to define that as, the Turkish state, but that kind of has been thrown into just Turkish nationalism on the ethnic side. Then you have secularism, which I spoke about before, and then reformism of reforming all the Ottoman institutions. So one of my problems was, in terms of saying, how can the expression of political Islam, what lessons can we garner from this? Most Western pundits deem the AKP as an Islamic party. But, that's just the natural talking point that just gets recycled over and over. But I really wanted to look and say, are they actually an Islamic party? And so I basically went with the working definition of Islamism is the Islamists are those who reject the separation of religious authority from the power of the state. So essentially that you have, instead of that, the state controlling the mosque, in this case you would have the mosque controlling the state, and this is what you see in Iran. So that's a little bit tricky when you have this kind of authoritarian secularism that, here is a quote I took from one of my sources, is that you have the erosion of an assertive and authoritarian secularism. So when we see secularism in Turkey, we're not meaning, the liberating sense that you have in the Western world. You're having a more authoritarian sense. And so basically, my conclusion is the AKP party today does not seem to be an Islamist party, but seems to be maintaining the social conservative line. Whether that's going to change in the coming years, I'm not sure. But to date, that was one of the working things, is that you can't really say the lessons drawn from the AKP can immediately be cannot immediately be applied to Hamas, the Iranian regime, the Muslim Brotherhood. You cannot just transfer the lessons to and fro, because the AKP has made a lot of strides to say we are not an Islamist party. We draw a lot of our moral guiding principles from Islam in terms of governing laws, but that they're not an Islamist party. So that's going to restrict a lot of creating a model and then copying and pasting it across the Islamic world. That creates a lot of problems. So despite the current things that are going on, I'm a bit of an optimist, although this picture doesn't necessarily tell it. So despite what's going on right now, this is a picture from the Gezi Park protest that started on the previous year, and it kind of shows like the essence of the crackdown of what's going on liberalism in Turkey. You can flip it again. Like I said, Twitter was banned previously. I think the court just overturned it, but that they're taking their time and undoing it. You can flip it again. And this was a rally this is Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan hosting a rally in Istanbul, and this is 1 million plus people, or at least that's what they say. So this is the kind of jingless, populism that I'm a little worried about when it comes to liberalism in Turkey. So we can keep going. But despite all those kind of things, the populism, the banning of social media, and the crackdown on protesters, I'm still making a case that there is a strand of liberalism within the AKP that, despite all the authoritarian things that are going on now, and that's kind of hard because as I'm trying to make the case that there is, true liberalism within the AKP, greater and greater crackdowns began asserting themselves. So that became a little problematic, but I'm still holding the line on my conclusions. Real briefly, so you have, these are just a few of the main points, that you have a split from the national outlook. In Turkish, it's Milli Görüş, which is the former, it was really prominent in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of the way in which you interpreted Islam in the political realm, and it would roughly be equivalent to what you see with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. It's really authoritarian, not that conducive to liberal democracy. But within, when there was a breakdown within the Islamist parties in the late 90s, you had the National Outlook group, and then you had Tayyip Erdogan and Abdullah Gül and the current younger leaders of the AKP, and they split with, when the elections were coming up, they split with the National Outlook ideology and said we're going to abandon that and move forward with a more progressive line, along with conservative parties in Europe. So I think that's a strong case that they really did make a distinct split. Secondly, there's a growing civil society within the religious sectors, and I put the Hizmet movement there. So a lot of political science, you say, if you really want liberalism, you really want a robust democracy, you have to have civil society, which is something most countries in this region are lacking. But actually, the largest civil society organization in Turkey right now is the Hizmet movement, which is led by a religious scholar, Fethullah Gülen, who actually resides in Pennsylvania. Because of persecution, he has to flee. But they have established a very robust network of civil society organizations, and I think that, and they are, these are religiously influenced organizations. So you have the civil society kind of supporting that whole idea of, yes, there will be liberalism because we're developing these non-state actors that are still politically active and still influencing society. Thirdly, a lot of the things, the way in which Islam is interpreted within the AKP is quite distinct from the way the MHP has defined itself. So the MHP sees it as Turkish nationalism with Islam. The AKP has said, no, the Kurdish conflict, because the Kurds are quite religious themselves, the Kurdish conflict doesn't really make sense to the AKP because they see, there's always the realpolitik calculations going on, but from an ideological perspective, the AKP interprets it as, no, the Kurds are our, Muslim brothers residing in the same state, rather than the MHP, who interprets Islam in a completely the fact that they don't even recognize the Kurdish ethnicity as being distinct. So I think that interpretation and that kind of approach to like the bloodiest conflict in Turkish history, I think that's going to be really helpful moving forward. The fourth point would be high economic growth. Although you can have high economic growth without liberalism, without democracy, as we've seen in China, Vietnam, and places like this, I think that does help the case that they've been managing the economy quite well, that they've been exposing themselves to foreign markets. They've actually signed a customs agreement with the European Union, which basically gives the EU a lot of control over the Turkish economy, which I think is a bad mistake, but I think that's a good sign of liberalism, is that or at least a strand of liberalism, is that they can move forward to integrating themselves with regional economies. Fourthly is a commitment to the EU and staying in NATO. I think that's going to be one of the key things to promoting liberalism within political Islam in Turkey, within this party, is that they are fully integrated into two of the most important Western institutions, which are the European Union, which they're trying to become a member of, and they're already a member of NATO. They're a founding member. So since I think that'll help kind of as a restraining factor onto the party's development. And lastly, in terms of the case for liberalism, Abdullah Gül's presidency, right now there's, in the past 3 years, has been a development of Erdogan as, the charismatic populist, and then Abdullah Gül as more of the moderate, who might not galvanize 1 million people in Istanbul, but who's still a very articulate and moderate leader. And that's going to come into fray now because the battle for the presidency is about to begin in August. If we can flip again. So some of my conclusions is, this is very brief, of course, and I've had to run through everything. So the current AKP is a mixed bag. You have a lot of expansion of rights, you have a growing economy, but then you have stifling of dissent with the protest recently and with the Twitter ban. So it's definitely a mixed bag. So they're not necessarily a liberal party, but there are liberal elements within the party that I think can be fostered and can be developed into a more conservative party along European lines. Like I said, namely Abdullah Gül, the development of civil society is really promising, and then you have the integration of Western institutions, which are restraining factors. The implications, I concluded that they weren't very likely, given the fact that one, I said the AKP wasn't a Islamic party under my working definition. And most importantly, to copy and paste, say, the lessons learned from the AKP in Turkey and paste them into Saudi Arabia would not quite work because of a number of historical factors. Turkey is on that borderline with Europe and Asia, so they have a lot of that cultural influence that helps incorporate liberalism. I'm an institutionalist, so of course the Western institutions as well. So something like that could not be applied. I think it maybe could be applied to certain sectors like Tunisia or something, but I don't think that this doesn't represent a model for political Islam in the rest of the Muslim world. So, thank you. And thank you to Dr. Orem as my thesis advisor as well. Any questions? Well, party discipline is a major thing in this aspect. So a lot of folks are not willing to move against the prime minister or for fear of being ostracized. But yeah, there has been a number of things moving. A lot of folks who are following Gül, a lot of folks who are criticizing, and actually, I think it's quite telling that the president himself, once the ban came into effect, the president himself went around the ban and started publishing on Twitter on how the ban, was unconstitutional, directly challenging his compatriot Erdogan. So I think this is one of those things that might be helpful.
How do you think that's going to influence events in Turkey, and in sort of your experience and research, how do those leftist Western ideals mesh with political Islam?
Essentially, I would say I don't want to be so dismissive, but they're pretty much irrelevant. I mean, you have, your communist factions and things like this, but they're pretty much irrelevant because nationalism plays such a major force in Turkish identity and in Turkish political activism. So almost every political party, aside from the fourth one, which is the Kurdish party, is very nationalistic, which goes against the leftist kind of ideals. So because nationalism plays such a strong role in all the three major parties, I don't see that being much of a factor at all, sadly. Thank you.
Okay, and last but not least, we have Courtney Barrett, and she'll be talking about the new gold standard in New York City's Counterterrorism Bureau.
Thank you for staying. I know we're really over. We all like to talk. Okay, so my topic is, can y'all hear me without this? Oh, okay. My topic is the new gold standard, New York City's Counterterrorism Bureau, and you're probably wondering why I am talking about a counterterrorism bureau for my honors thesis. It's a pretty common thing, but what you need to focus on is the city. The fact that this is a counterterrorism bureau that is based solely out of New York City. It is a state agency. It is not operated by the federal government, which is as I go through the presentation, you're going to be like, okay, this seems really common, but you need to remember that this is on the state, or on the state level, which is what makes it so unique from normal counterterrorism bureaus. I'm going to speed through, and I can take some things out so we can get to lunch. And there's not many pictures because you can only look at a New York City police detective so many times before it gets really boring. But it's really important to know what the New York City Police Department was like prior to 9/11, because obviously what stirred this were the plane crashes on 9/11, which we all know about. But the response, counterterrorism was not the responsibility of the state. It was left in the hands of the federal government. They were thought to be the only people that had adequate enough resources to actually tackle the amount of manpower and the information gathering that would need to be responsible. So at the time of the 9/11 attacks, this counterterrorism bureau in New York City did not exist. This is completely new since 2001. There was a joint terrorism task force that was led by the FBI that was put in place in 1980. It didn't really help the state that much. There's about a couple hundred federal agents compared to the 20 local agents from New York City that were actually on this task force. So their main loyalty was to the federal government. It wasn't to the citizens of New York City. And so it was really disproportionate, and the New York officers were really there just as figureheads. They weren't really doing that much, and communication was horrible between them. There was an intelligence division in the New York City Police Department, which becomes really important in the Counterterrorism Bureau, but they were considered as glorified escorts. It's nothing that you would think of an intelligence division now where people sit behind computers and are hacking into things. If you think of when UN delegates came in, they would figure out their routes, make sure no one was going to try to kill them, and they would escort them around. So they were the glorified escorts for VIPs. There was really no true intelligence division for what you would think of. And the force, the easiest way to think about this is think of all those old-time Hollywood movies where all the New York City police officers are corrupt. Take away the Hollywood glamour, and that's what you have. I looked at police commissioners from 1994 onward, and it really was just one corrupt police commissioner after the other. They were really trying to outdo themselves. It wasn't much to promote the city and try to take away that stigma of corruption as much as just leaving the corruption in there. As a really good example is actually the police commissioner that was on duty for the 9/11 attacks. A few years later, he was indicted on 16 criminal corruption charges, and throughout his trial, a bunch of ethics violations that happened while he was in office were brought about. So there was really nothing that they did. So you're starting with a horrible foundation for this huge new project that needs to come in. The Counterterrorism Bureau itself, the Division of Labor, is relatively easy to understand. At the top is Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly. I'll go into him in a second. He's considered the father of this whole Counterterrorism Bureau. And then you have the Intelligence Division and the Counterterrorism Division. I know the flowchart is kind of up and down, but it's really not. It's not a top-down bureaucracy. It's not up to the top. They all it's like a circle. They all work together. But Kelly realized that in order for this to have any weight, to have recognition whatsoever, he needed to get people who were really experienced. So the head of the Intelligence Division that he pulled in had a 35-year career with the CIA, so he knew his stuff. And the Counterterrorism Division, don't confuse that with the Bureau. The Intelligence Division are the people that sit behind the computers, and the Division are more like the boots on the ground. It's easier to think of them that way. But the deputy commissioner that he pulled in there was a retired U.S. Marine Corps general. He had worked with the UN, so they brought a lot of authority to this new bureau that no one thought could really make it. Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly, he's considered the father of this whole bureau. He really started from the top down. He started as a cadet in the 60s, worked his way up, and actually when he was installed as police commissioner after the 9/11 attacks, it wasn't his first time as police commissioner. He had served it from 92 to 94, and they say that his 2 years in office beforehand really characterized how this Counterterrorism Bureau would start, because his time in office was characterized as the broken window policy. So if you think of when a rock hits your windshield, you want to take care of it before it scatters. So that was his policy in 92, and it really carried over to when he started this Counterterrorism Bureau. He realized that terrorism needed to be addressed by the state. It wasn't a federal problem. If you wanted to protect your city, you needed to get your own people devoted to your city to protect this. So that was kind of the foundation for the whole bureau. And that this was going to be a large task and that he was going to step on some toes. And there needed to be unity between the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the FBI, the CIA, and he needed to get even the officers on the ground to kind of rid this perception that all their supervisors were against them. And they all needed to work together, because if they weren't unified, this wasn't going to work in any sort of way. And his goal for the organization was an organization with minimal bureaucracy and maximum freedom of movement, able to anticipate threats and able to act on information. So if they found a tip, they needed to be able to go. They didn't need to wait for the federal red tape. Okay, so the intelligence division. They needed to completely restructure this if it was going to be anything. I'm going to go through. Okay. This was going to be really hard to be independent from a federal agency because intelligence gathering was in the hands of the FBI. So Cohen used his experience as a CIA operative and actually started a hire from within policy. And he realized his best resources were the officers that were currently employed by the NYPD. So he used that to bring people up because he knew they would be the best protectors. And for example, the linguistics program, ooh, hi Mike. It's now internationally renowned. Within 12 months of it starting, he literally sent out a memo. It seems so simple, and whenever all the interviews about it, he really talks about it in a mocking fashion. Like, you can imagine him just rolling his eyes while he's talking about it. Because he just sent out a memo to everyone in the NYPD and was like, hey, does anyone want to take a linguistics test? And within the initial test, he had 200 master linguists that were on the street cops. So he promoted from within because they were going to be the people whose families were in the city, whose kids were going to school, and they needed to be protected. We can skip the cyber intelligence unit. Okay, so the actual counterterrorism division is completely new. They had no manual, they had nothing to go off of. They started from nothing. In the first 14 months, no one actually really knows what was going on because who he had originally hired refused any interviews, and he reported directly to Commissioner Kelly. So it's kind of a secret start to the infancy. The only real thing that New Yorkers knew what was going on was by that quote from Mayor Bloomberg in a press release one time, and that's all they really knew, what was going on with this counterterrorism division. So in 2004, Kelly did a little bit of an overhaul, brought in another guy who had a great track record, just like everyone else, and he's really, they really contribute the start of the counterterrorism division to him. But he realized that the boots on the ground needed to be an independent body from the FBI as well. I mean, it was the New York City police officers who were putting themselves on the line when a terrorist attack was coming, so they needed to be able to work independently. And the theme of stepping on the FBI's toes comes around a lot, and it's a huge problem that they see. I mean, it's a territorial dispute that is a common thread throughout the whole paper. But the actual logistics, I thought this was pretty cool. You might not think it is, but the building is just an unmarked red brick building in southern Brooklyn. Like, the only pictures that there are the pictures that they allow you to take in this one intelligence room. It's really cool. They have like tons of computers. But it's large enough where they can have some of the most advanced intelligence computers and everything, but they also can do training exercises there as well. But no one actually really knows the blueprints or how it's set up. There's about 130 uniformed and civilian officers that work in the actual counterterrorism division, but there's coordination with the officers and the other precincts in New York. And the most important thing that they say drives this counterterrorism division, even though they do have the capabilities to deal with a biological, chemical, or nuclear attack, is the cop sense. And that's what they really promote themselves on, that they say no matter how much new technology they give to a detective, the most important thing is going to be their intuition, because they've been doing this for so long. So that drives it, and they make sure not to push out your day-to-day cop operations by technology. It was really important. Commissioner Kelly realized that one of the easiest ways to protect New York City from a terrorist attack was for terrorists to see that they were doing things. So they needed a public presence. I found this really interesting. They do surges, which happen almost daily, which they'll pick from the top down. They have different themes, like they could do a subway theme or like Times Square theme. And all of a sudden, 76 black unmarked cars just storm into an area. These cops in like body armor and machine guns just come out, and you don't know if it's a real terrorist attack or whether or not they're just doing a drill. And all the interviews, it's kind of funny to watch people, their initial reaction, they're just so scared at first. And they're like, oh my gosh, what is going on? And then you see the sense of relief and how thankful they are. But it really brings out the emotion that they want to see that if you're going to threaten New York City, there are forces and they're ready to go. And then they needed Cohen, the intelligence division head, realized that you couldn't fault the citizens of New York for selling terrorist or possible terrorist things. Like, it wasn't their fault. They weren't educated. And so one of the first things they implemented was Operation Nexus. And it's really easy. You just go online, fill out information about your business, and an intelligence division officer will come and highlight all the weaknesses of your business that could be taken advantage of by a terrorist. So they needed public involvement in order to stop. They wanted to get these from every area. And it's not just an image thing. They have these group called red cells, and it's about 4 or 5 people, and they'll randomly, it's kind of like surges, but they'll be like, okay, well, let's see if we can go to this store and try to buy 30 pounds of something from them and see if they'll actually call the cops on them. And they do it all the time, and I would say a good 3 out of 5 times, no one really thinks of anything, but if you don't call the cops, an intelligence division officer will go there and just be like, hey, just wanted to remind you, you could do this to help protect the city. And so that was an increase in their public presence, and this is probably one of the more controversial aspects of the Counterterrorism Bureau is the international presence. And obviously, you think of international, it's the International Liaison Program. The New York Police Department has formal agreements with 11 foreign cities where their officers go, and it's really important they don't help out in active investigations. They're simply there to gather intelligence that will relate back to New York City. So they're just there as an observer, and they just bring back information that will help protect the city. There's many, problems. The funding, there's no trail to where it's all privately funded. So there's no actual budget report, and it's really controversial because there's been reports that Commissioner Kelly, before he stepped down, apparently he used $300,000 of it to buy his country club membership. So there's all these theories that go up. So no one really knows. So that's behind it. And then the federal government is saying that this isn't the job of the New York Police Department. Foreign relations is all on them. So it's a territorial dispute again. Okay. Just briefly, they recognize that they constantly need to be evolving. They can't stand still, and that terrorism is evolving, and potential attacks, they're going to adapt to this. So they are constantly making new programs that are going to stick or keep up with any new terrorist programs. Yeah, we can go. Okay. I'll just really fast. But the Mumbai attacks of 2008, which we all or probably don't, but it was a series of 11 bombing and shooting attacks over 4 days, which is a really long time if you think about it, in 2008, and they struck cafes, hospitals, they came in through the port, it was at train stations, so it was kind of every arena that you could think of. And so there was an officer in the International Liaison Program stationed in Jordan when this attack originally happened, and he knew someone working with the Mumbai Police Department through personal connections, and he was able to get over there and actually observe, and he reported back to Commissioner Kelly what was going on, and Commissioner Kelly was able to call Mumbai and be like, hey, we're going to send 3 officers over, and these are actually screenshots from the report that these 3 officers, I guess you can't really see it, but these 3 officers completed. It's a 49-page report, and it's extremely detailed. It's not what you would think it'd be. I mean, the picture on the right is simply of a stairwell that they used for 30 seconds while they were walking somewhere else. There's pictures of gunshots into the concrete. So it's not just of the actual tragedy, it's how they did it. And they carried it out, and they brought it back to New York, and it directly changed how they evolved counterterrorism in New York City. So you can click. So how they used it was the demographics. Mumbai was really closely related to New York. It was an entertainment hub. It was multicultural. There was a water port. It was a financial capital. So obviously this was a really good area to study. They came in through the water, and so Commissioner Kelly actually was called in front of a Homeland Security Council to explain how they got all of this information and how they were able to revamp themselves. It's just no one really federal agencies are just amazed by the capabilities that this bureau has brought on. So they saw that they came in through a water approach. So now a certain amount of Port Authority carry machine guns. So just in case, because they know first responders won't get there in time, realistically, so they carry machine guns. And now divers are allowed to inspect the hulls and underneath all of the ships that come in. They really vamped up Operation Nexus because how this attack carried out, it was in so many different locations that had someone known what a suspicious person had looked like, they might have been able to stop it in, say, a cafe. Maybe not in the hospital, but in a local business, you may have been like, red flag. So they really vamped that up. And now officers are routinely trained on 3 heavy weapons because it's just routine training for if a standoff comes this long, and that way they can assist the first responders. And organized crime officers are now given even more intensive training to where if they would be after the emergency responders, if a standoff was to last for a while, they would come in and they would be the next wave, and then weapons trainings. So they really have a system for now if it's a longer standoff, not just like a 12-hour period, they can last. And then the really sketchy one is cell phone and media coverage. They recognize that cell phones are obviously the easiest way for terrorists to communicate with one another, but none of the documents exactly tell you how they dealt with the cell phone coverage, which they just say they dealt with it, which is obvious because if everyone knows, then you can get around it. But, okay, I know that's a really brief overview of it. It's really complex, as is everyone's. 15 minutes is really hard to get it all out. But it's key to remember that this is a hybrid FBI-CIA bureau on a local level, which is what is so amazing for it. Since its conception in 2002, they've stopped 16 terrorist attacks, which is huge. But 2014 is going to be a really critical year because the original commissioner stepped down and he was replaced, and the counterterrorism division has kind of gone through a few heads, but David Cohen, who's the head of the intelligence division, has just been replaced by a journalist. So there's mixed feelings about that. So it's kind of a pivotal year, so we'll see what happens, but even if you think it's too controversial, like they're stepping on the federal government's toes, you have to give them credit because this was a huge effort that was taken out. And they've done it relatively well, in my opinion. I'm a little biased, but yes, okay. Take a breath. Oh my God. I think I got it in 15. If there's no questions, we can go to lunch. Thank you. No. Because how they do it is they divide it into a bunch of parts. So, I mean, if I went into my paper, you could calculate it all. It's a very high budget, but because they get a lot of private sector fundings, it's really hard to figure out the actual budget, but it's huge. I can guarantee you that.
So it seems like that, and unfortunately, even the word counterterrorism itself, that terrorism has to happen, and then it's responding to it. And you mentioned a little bit about the proactive measures that are being taken, being trained in assault weapons and things like that. But what are some of the things that you think is preventing these organizations from being more proactive? Because one thing it seems to me is that, and I think some of this arises out of 9/11, was the failure to communicate between the FBI, the CIA, Secret Service, whoever, don't want to share what information they have. But is there anything that you found that you think is more preventive?
Yes, I had to skip over it. It was one of the things I skipped over, but they do have a whole section devoted to homegrown terrorism because they realize that that's probably the most immediate threat in the evolution of terrorism. And it's a really controversial report just because it did focus on Islam only, but they do have ways of where they profile how terrorism is born homegrown. So they do have preventative measures in place for if you read the report, it's a lot of the time domestic terrorist attacks don't actually occur. I would say they studied 16 different, they call them, it's a horrible word, but they call them little cells. And out of the 16 they studied, none of them actually got to the point where they were going to the final step to commit the terrorist plot. So a lot of the times they stopped themselves. It's weird, but happens.
Like particularly among citizens or among like the land or like policy analysts, any critiques of sort of the hyper-militarization of the standings of these forces that came along with this?
Yes. Okay. It sounds, just because what I went over, it sounds really hyper-militarized, but it's not. It's actually, they call them Hercules teams and the counter-response vehicles. It is a select area. They do have the training, but it's just training. It's not like the everyday police officer is going to be carrying around a heavy assault rifle. What the everyday police officer will be carrying around, for example, will be like a radiation detector. So it's not like you have the military. The New York Police Department is all of a sudden beginning to become its own little military. So it is a select faction. Oh, Dr. Orm. That's not one of the ones I studied in. I didn't do my case study on that. Sorry.
You mentioned that in their report on domestic terrorism, they focus pretty heavily on homegrown Islamic terrorism. Do you know any specific reason why they focus exclusively on that when the major domestic terrorist incidents in the U.S. have generally involved extreme right-wing militias?
Yes, in the defense of it, because as soon as it came out, reporters were going crazy over it, and they kind of justified it themselves by saying it was a certain case study, although the title was obviously Homegrown Terrorism, Radicalization in the West. So you knew it wasn't just a specific case study of Islam. So the way they defend themselves is saying that it was. Okay.